Reflective essay, The Nature and Framing of Imperial Russia in Historical Discourse. Historians have written volumes on Imperial Russia. At the base of this historiography is the central theme of the Imperial Russian state's compulsion to strengthen itself by enculturating the political, material, and social technologies of their geopolitical rivals, be they from the east or west. Stemming from this central theme in Russian history is the view of the Russian state as a synthesis of Eastern and Western cultures, valuing both the mystical, Eastern, and pragmatic, Western. This synthesis became symbolized in the person of the Tsar, who drew legitimacy from his role as a divinely mandated patriarch of the Russian Empire, as well as a shrewd head of state. Historians have grappled with the issue of framing the period of Imperial Russia. They have had to judge at what points were changes in Tsarist policy not merely cosmetic, but fundamentally restructured the state and the minds of Russia's people. Notably, a minority of historians have seen the drastic political and psychological shifts that stem from Alexander II's 1861 emancipation of the serfs as the endpoint to the fundamental structure of Imperial Russia. However, the majority of historians have opted to view the existence of the title of Tsar as the critical element in categorizing Russia's imperial period, due to the importance or even primacy of symbolic representations in both Imperial Russia and in the present day. Academics and teachers will likely find the later form of historical framing to be more useful in conveying to readers and students the importance of the rejection of the Romanov name and its Tsarist mythology that was solidified in the 1917 revolutions. The theme of the Imperial Russian state arising from enculturation has been articulated most notably by Nikolai Sergeyevich Trubetskoy, 1890-1938, a Russian philologist of aristocratic ancestry, who argued that the structure of the Russian state lay heavily in Mongolian administrative and cultural structures. In his essay entitled The Legacy of Genghis Khan, Trubetskoy argues that during the period of the Mongolian imperial domination over much of present-day Russia, then known as Kievan Rus, the loosely confederated warring principalities of Kievan Rus sought to utilize the model of administrative patriarchy practiced by the Mongolian Empire as a means to develop a viable weapon to repel Mongol domination. In order for this to be achieved, the leaders of Kievan Rus looked to the ideology of the Byzantine state as something analogous in the cultural experience of Kievan Rus to the ideology of the Mongolian Empire. Previously unpopular Byzantine state ideology, which emphasized the rule of a powerful emperor over a system of administrative bureaucracy, was cultivated and romanticized by Russians, who were looking for a way to utilize the tools of the Mongolian state without having to culturally capitulate to it. For Trubetskoy, this process culminated with the placement of the Mongolian Khan with the Muscovite Tsar, demonstrated notably by Ivan IV's conquest of peripheral Mongolian territories, after which he declared himself not only Tsar, but White Khan. In essence, despite Tsarist pretensions about mythical links to Judeo-Christendom in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Tsarist state, in actuality, was a successor to the Mongolian imperial state. These ideas were expanded upon by modern historians such as Charles J. Halpern in his monograph, Russia and the Golden Horde, where he elaborates on the high level of cultural interaction between Mongolian and Russian culture. These interactions were made possible on elite levels via strategic political alliances between heads of Russia principalities and Mongol imperial officials. On mass levels, cultural interactions between Russian and Mongolian cultures was enabled by interaction on steppe trade routes. For Halpern, the high level of interaction between Russian and Mongolian culture was marginalized or ignored by historians of early imperial Russian sensitive to the memory of Mongolian oppression. He termed this the ideology of silence. Imperial Russia's practice of enculturation was by no means limited to its eastern geopolitical rivals. Many historians mark the beginning of Imperial Russian history with the rise of Peter the Great in 1700, whose drastic policies of westernization gave Imperial Russia the appearance of a modern European state. However, despite the construction of modern cities like St. Petersburg and an emphasis on the importance of meritocracy, the mystical significance of the Tsar as an embodiment of divine will on earth remained the ideological cornerstone of the Peter's rule. Russian historian V.O. Kluchevsky, 1841 to 1911, is perhaps the standard by which Tsarist biographers measure themselves. His portrayal of Peter the Great was that of an irreverent, charismatic leader and ruthless modernizer who borrowed heavily from Western European culture. For Peter, the merits of Western culture were encapsulated in Western aristocratic dress, modern cities, meritocracy, and a modern military. Peter came to embody the Tsar as both a charismatic father figure as well as a leader who was willing to spill vast amounts of blood in order to build a modern Russian state. This led to the grim maxim, St. Petersburg was built on bones. For Klitschevsky, Peter's Western reforms were made possible by events preceding his rule that were causing Russian leaders to look to the West for solutions to problems they saw confronting the continuation of the Tsarist state. According to Klitschevsky, the lack of a czar between the Rurik and Romanov dynasties, known as the Time of Troubles, lead the Russian elite to begin developing a national consciousness, akin to those of Western Europe. In essence, the Russia state was in existence without being embodied in the form of the Tsar. In the minds of Russian citizens, the state was becoming identified with its population, not simply its leader. However, this did not mean that the ideal of a just Tsar was abolished. On the contrary, there now appeared to be a need to merge aspects of Western values with Tsarist ideals of a divinely mandated patriarch. Klitschevsky quotes an imperial ambassador from 1683 as expressing concern over the comparative lack of education that existed in Russia compared to the divine right monarchies of Western Europe. Our Russian people are gross and unlearned. Not only plain men, but also men of the clergy, do seek not the verities or understanding of Holy Writ, but do slander those who are learned and call them heretics. Klitschevsky sees Peter and his successors as fundamentally frightened that Russia was not born for civilization and must, in her vexation, plunge herself into abasement. Russia's enculturation of Mongolian state structure and the fevered Western pursuit of modernity have led historians to describe Imperial Russia as a synthesis between Eastern and Western political values. This view may be best to be embodied in historians' portrayal of Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 96. Catherine has been noted for describing herself as an enlightened despot, a charge which historians such as Isabel de Madariaga deeply believe. In essence, Catherine claimed her role as a divine right monarch would be used to pursue Western ideals of reason and legality for the Russian nation. This resulted in Catherine's investment in various social welfare projects such as schools, hospitals, almshouses, and houses of correction. However, Catherine's legitimacy as regent was precarious, since she was not a Romanov by blood, and she had seized the throne by a coup, which resulted in her husband Peter III's death. Despite Catherine's pretensions of enlightenment, she was also reviled by Russian serfs who suffered greatly due to her policies, which strengthened the power of noble landlords. This enabled the Cossack rebel Pugachev to stir a violent peasant revolt by posing as the returning messianic Peter III, promising to free peasants from the yoke of Catherine's tyranny. After a bloody conflict in which roughly 1,600 noble families were killed, Pugachev was captured, tried, and killed. In a grand gesture of her enlightened despotism, Catherine had Pugachev beheaded before he was drawn and quartered. The Tsarist system was buttressed by a socio-political ideal of divinely mandated hierarchy. In essence, serf answered to noble, noble answered to Tsar, and Tsar answered to God. Once this ideal of stratification and mystification was compromised, the intellectual and spiritual foundations of the Tsarist state were endangered. At the start of the 1860s, the system of serfdom began to hinder Russia's economic and military development. The Imperial Russian desire for Western modernization began to undermine the Eastern autocratic mysticism that energized the Tsarist enterprise. Russia's loss in the Crimean War was, in part, attributed to Russia's lack of a citizen army. As long as serfs remained tied to the land of Russian nobles, the imperial army would remain disadvantaged in terms of manpower compared to Western European armies. Furthermore, Tsar Alexander II's desire to modernize and maximize agricultural output was stifled by serf unrest and passive resistance. In addition, within Russia's state bureaucracy, many enlightened officials sought to strengthen the Tsarist state by introducing radical reforms designed to increase the state's moral legitimacy and decrease corruption in its bureaucratic machinery. Acquiescing to the calls for reform and modernization, Alexander II liberated the serfs, albeit on terms that left them with less land than they had under encirclement. However, despite Alexander II's reforms, bureaucratic corruption persisted. Newly freed serfs remained severely marginalized, and urban industrialization was beginning to form an alienated working class. This combination proved explosive and resulted in Alexander II's assassination in 1881 at the hands of leftist terrorists. To preserve the Tsarist system, reforms needed to be introduced. However, these reforms, ironically, mortally undermined the system they were meant to save. In addition, Alexander II's reforms fractured the ideological structure of Tsarist patriarchy. Once the divinely appointed Tsar subordinated himself to human laws, the mists of supernatural justification for centuries of violent dictatorship evaporated. This produced a psychological shift in the minds of many in the Imperial Russian state, resulting in a growing public and administrative apathy to the Tsarist project. By the reign of Nicholas II, the contradictions manifest in the Tsarist state had given rise to mass strikes, powerful radical ideologies, and a growing perception of Nicholas II as either treacherous or grossly incompetent. The massive loss of life that stemmed from Russian involvement in Bahai, along with the plummeting standards of living, proved too great a challenge for the Romanov dynasty. In the face of military insurrection and bread riots, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate in February of 1917 in the first of two populist revolutions. In July 1918, in the midst of the ruthless Russian Civil War, Nicholas and his family were killed by the Bolshevik government to prevent the increasing prospect of imperial counter-revolution, thus ending the Romanov dynasty. The issue of framing of Imperial Russia in a historical narrative can be a contentious issue. While conventional wisdom uses 1700 as a starting point, historians such as Trubetskoy and Halpern illustrate that the imperial state was forged in the time of the Golden Horde and was solidified most notably under Ivan IV. However, the fusion of Eastern and Western culture with the personality and accomplishments of Peter the Great provides a clear starting point for understanding the essential characteristics of the Tsarist state. One may also argue against view that Imperial Russia ended in 1917 and as started above under Alexander II's policies caused fundamental structural shifts that transformed the Tsarist state. Furthermore, methodologies of Tsarist rule continued in the Soviet period, notably political assassinations of perceived rivals and the expansion of the bureaucratic state. However, the symbol of the Tsar is the critical element in understanding the Tsarist state. As long as the Tsar existed, there was a human embodiment of transcendent meta-beliefs centered around divine right monarchy. Even if fundamental authoritarian methodologies remain over time, shifts in symbolic representations of these authoritarian structures convey important ruptures in historical continuity. It is the understanding of these ruptures and consistencies that helps both academic and student understand Russia's change and continuity over time. Bibliography. Craycraft, James. Klitschevsky on Peter the Great. Ed. James Craycraft. Major Problems in Imperial Russia. Cengage Learning, 1994. De Madariaga. Isabel. Catherine the Great, A Short History. New Haven, Yale University Press, 1990. De Madariaga, Isabel. Russia in the Age of Catherine the Great. London. Phoenix Press, 1980. Halpern, Charles J. Russia and the Golden Horde. Bloomington. Indiana University Press, 1985. Horner, Lisa. Wilson, Josh. St. Petersburg, Russia's Vortex of Change. Klitschevsky, V.O. A History of Russia, Volume 3. New York. Russell and Russell, 1960. Lincoln W. Bruce. In the Vanguard of Reform, Russia's Enlightened Bureaucrats. Northern Illinois University Press, 1982. Maurice, Michel Lamarche. A Woman's Kingdom. Noble Women and the Control of Property in Russia. 1800. 1861. Cornell University Press, 2002. Rysanovsky, Nicholas V. Steinberg, Mark D. A History of Russia. Oxford University Press, 2001. Windhausen, John D. The Legacy of Genghis Khan and Other Essays on Russia's Identity by Nikolai Sergeyevich Trubetskoy. Anatoly Liberman. Studies in East European Thought, 1997.